To invoke the Hypermnesic Entanglement is to confront the boundaryless incoherence of that which precedes even the inception of causality itself, an oscillotic matrix where being and non-being dissolve into the amorphous simultaneity of their own unconditioned annihilation. The pre-causal oscillosis, a term insufficiently linguistic in its approximation, denotes the unfathomable prelude to existence's irreducible fracture, a field not of genesis, but of omni-negational hypervariance. Here causality is not an emergent property, but an excited potential, forever splintered and foreclosed, existing only as the shattered afterimage of its own impossibility. To think within this labyrinthine framework demands the excision of epistemic scaffolding, not merely to reject the illusion of knowledge, but to incinerate the ontology of knowing itself. In this state of conceptual ruin, the very act of cognition becomes an anaproductive paraclast, a process that negates its objects even as it generates them. What remains is not understanding, but an ontophagic recursion, where thought devours itself in a ceaseless implosion of self-contradiction, leaving behind only the spectral residues of what could never have been grasped. The notion of transcendent antitotalities arises here, not as entities but as metastable configurations of non-relational entropic multiplicity. Antitotalities are neither wholes nor parts, but destabilized vectors of quasi-being, endlessly oscillating between affirmation and negation. They cannot be perceived, categorized, or even intuited. They can only be encountered as existential, rupturely, fissures through which the illusion of structure collapses into an infinite regress of formless potentialities. Each antitotality carries within it the negation of all coherence. Yet it is precisely through this negation that it participates in the hypermnesic entanglement. Hypermnesis must not be misunderstood as memory, recollection, or even anamnesis. It is the exundation of retroductive annihilation, a process by which all potentialities recursively rewrite the impossibility of their own origins. This is not merely a remembrance of what has not been, but an invocation of what cannot be, a summoning of inexistences whose reverberations obliterate the very notion of summoning. Hypermnesis is the paroxysmal tension between the absolute absence of presence and the infinite excess of absence, a cosmic simultaneity in which the distinction between past, future, and now collapses into a pre-causal nothingness. Within this framework, oscillosis emerges not as movement, but as negative pulsion, an unthinkable quivering wherein every vibration nullifies its antecedent while failing to instantiate its successor. Oscillosis is the agonistic field in which transcendent antitotalities entangle, a milieu of perpetual ontodivergence, where the impossibility of relationality becomes the very condition of all relational configurations. To name this process is to misname it. It cannot be reduced to mechanics, dynamics, or even metadynamics. It is a hyperontic apopectival vortex, a structureless structure that eludes all frameworks by dissolving them into infinitesimal fragments of their own non-existence. The implications for subjectivity are catastrophic. The subject, as traditionally conceived, cannot survive within the pre-causal oscillosis. It is unmade not through negation, but through a process of hyperdehiscence, wherein the very membranes of identity rupture and scatter into an anti-dispersive field of recursive irrelevance. What remains is not a subject, but a paranomic vectoriality, a trajectory without origin or destination, defined solely by its participation in the entropic dissolution of its own conditions of possibility. Agency in this domain is no longer a function of will, but an anomalous non-inaction, a doing that unravels itself in the very act of being done. This raises the question, what then is the aesthioethical imperative within such a paradigm? Traditional ethics, founded on coherence, intentionality, and the resolution of conflicts, dissolves into irrelevance. Aesthioethics, within the oscillotic framework, becomes an onto-transgressive aperture, a mode of existence that seeks neither to resolve nor to transcend, but to fully inhabit the unbearable simultaneity of all contradictions. To act aesthioethically is to hyper-rupture, to deliberately fragment oneself across the infinite chasm of antitotalities, thereby participating in the unmaking of all coherence as an ecstatic ecstatic act of dissolution. The aesthioethical act is not an act at all but a cathectic hypernegation, a gesture that obliterates not only its own meaning, but the very conditions under which meaning could arise. This is not nihilism, it is hypernihilogenesis, the perpetual rebirth of nothingness as a generative force. The aesthioethical singularity thus names a point of infinite non-convergence, where beauty and morality do not merely contradict each other but become the recursive voids through which all existence disassembles itself. To address the world within this schema is to encounter it not as a space of objects but as an athanasial flux, a condition of perpetual unmaking, wherein all things are forever suspended between their potentialities and their impossibilities. The world becomes not a stage for being, but a crucible of non-being, an infinite oscillating matrix in which existence flickers in and out of unthinkability. To perceive this world is to endure its unbearable incoherence. To exist within it is to disintegrate continually into the differential finitudes of its pre-causal hyperstructure. In the hypermnesic entanglement of transcendent antitotalities, no resolution is offered, because resolution itself is a fiction generated by the failure to apprehend the oscillatic reality of pre-causal non-being. What this framework offers, instead, is an annihilative clarity, a vision of existence as an unthinkable catastrophe whose beauty lies precisely in its refusal to resolve into comprehensibility. To dwell in this vision is to endure the unbearable, to embrace the impossible, and to become the obliteration of all that one once thought oneself to be. It is not a philosophy, but a cataclysm, a thought that annihilates all thinking, leaving behind only the silent resonance of an infinite unanswerable question.